Good evening, everybody. My name is Nick Bates, Assistant Director for Thurman Center Networks in the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground. Tonight, we are introducing our new, and I want to say limited series. Tonight, we're calling it Conversations with Kendi. We like the way that flows, but this series is designed to have conversations with our students and our distinguished lecturers, guests, faculty members, distinguished guests of the Thurman Center. We wanted to make sure that they have a dialogue that is directly with students. Because this was a priority of Dr. Thurman's throughout his time working at colleges and universities. On Saturdays at Morehouse, he started a sort of event where he would invite groups of students into his room where they would have conversations and dialogue over sherbet and boiled peanuts. And he would ask them questions that would relate to them and how they can impact them in today's American society. We wanted to find a way to do something very similar, but Thurman always made sure that these discussions happened with students a part of the table, not just in the room, but at the table, sharing meals and asking questions. At Howard, he had the Haitian delegation at times, which was the only black delegation at the time. And he made sure that the Haitian delegation were at his house, at his home where he lived with his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, as well as students. And this led to Sue Bailey Thurman being an early pioneer. I believe they had the Howard Wives Club. And so we wanted to make sure that we honor the Thurmans in such a way. And we're doing this first with Dr. Kendi. And this also gives students the opportunity to ask Dr. Kendi some questions. Our theme for tonight is a post election reflection on the organizing efforts of Black and Brown women in our past election that happened just a little bit under a month ago. We wanted to have the opportunity to discuss some of the themes that we saw and also find ways to inspire the future generation as they participate in civic engagement in our political environment. So to get started, everybody, I'm going to read some bios. I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to be quiet so you can enjoy the brilliance of these students and Dr. Kendi. I'm going to start with Dr. Kendi's bio first. Dr. Ibram X Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of the BU Center for Antiracist Research. He is a contributing writer at the Atlantic, a CBS News correspondent. He is the author of many books, including Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction and three number one New York Times bestsellers. How to Be an Anti-Racism, Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism and You, co-authored with Jason Reynolds, and Anti-Racist Baby, illustrated by Ashley Lukashevsky. He invites you to visit him online at ibramxkendi.com. Next, sitting to my right, we have Arshel Telemak. She's a senior in the College of Communication studying public relations and political science. She's an active member in the BU community, serving as a Howard Thurman Center student ambassador, a Charcoal Magazine editor in chief, and a radio DJ for WTBU. Arshia also wanted to include it that she loves to interrogate the idea of community to discover what it means and how we form them. She aspires to a career in media relations and crisis management, but in her downtime, she loves discovering and listening to new music, particularly 90s R&B and soul, Motown and indie rock, skateboarding, running, and most importantly, sleeping. Last on Zoom, we have Makaisha Hayes. She's a senior student athlete on the women's track and field team and is currently studying finance and information systems in the Question School of Business. She also holds a leadership position with the Student Athletes of Color organization and where she is their vice president. Additionally, she is a student athlete representative for BU on the Social Justice and Inclusion Committee, and she's a member of the Patriot League Anti-Racism Commission. And lastly, before I ask a question, I wanted to say these two students are really special to us in the HCC. Arshel has had the opportunity to participate in our student ambassador program for about the last 3 years, where we spend time actually reading the works of Dr. Thurman and finding ways to really understand his vision for community. And Makaisha Hayes came to us over a special partnership that the HTC has with Boston University Athletics to find ways to bring Thurman to athletics. And some of the ways we've been able to do that has enabled the launch of things like the Student Athlete of Color Group and the Terrier Town Halls. So we're excited to have you all here. With that being said, I'm going to ask you all the first question, and I think this is a question for everybody to answer. So I mentioned that Dr. Thurman had this tradition. He called them Saturday nights at his house. And one of the questions that he would ask was, and I think this is really important to what we experience as black and brown people, but people in general, as we read the news, as we engage the news, as we engage the world. This question is, how can we immunize ourselves against the destructive aspects of the environment? And so I think immunize is a question that Thurman would ask these students, and I think it's even more prevalent when we think about the context of living with a global and deadly pandemic. So again, I'll repeat, how can we immunize ourselves against the destructive aspects of the environment?
Should I, did you want me to answer first or?
Yours.
Well, I mean, I would say that, well, first, for me, I've learned to try to separate what I personally consider to be offensive from feeling offended. In other words, when someone says or does something to me that is indeed racist and thereby is offensive, I don't feel offended. I'm outraged, but I'm not outraged. Um, I'm outraged at what they did. I'm not necessarily personally feeling as if I have, as if there's something sort of wrong with me, and I try to sort of keep that. Uh, I try to ensure that I'm not feeling offended because I don't want to constantly allow people to get me down. um, but then I would also sort of add that when you truly recognize um, the persistence and pervasiveness of racism itself, when it shows up, it's not really going to sort of surprise you. And I find that sometimes people are shocked when racism knocks on their door, even though earlier in that day they were talking about racism being outside. So I think either you have to recognize its persistence and thereby when it shows up, um, not necessarily be surprised and shocked and wounded. Um, and or you recognize it's pervasive, and when it shows itself you're like, yep, I knew that was the case. When there's a thunderstorm, it's going to thunder, and the thunderstorm of racism is persisting over this country's history, and it still is today.
Yeah, that's a how do you immunize yourself against what's happening in the world? I think that's a very important question to ask, especially in today's context where there is every day you turn on the news and there's a new challenge or a new circumstance to tackle. And me coming from the perspective of I am a black woman and thinking about how the different issues in the world affect me is going to be much different from how people who aren't black women or who identify from the same communities as I do. They'll think and process these situations differently, and I think that's where a lot of conflict can arise. And I think how I personally go about the issue of immunizing myself is when there is an issue, for example, if there's an issue of race, or say there's an issue where my black womanhood is under scrutiny, especially in a place where, say for example, it is, whiteness prevails, and that is something that is regarded as the supreme idea or the supreme group. What I tend to do is not necessarily not take that into account personally, but what I do is I try to engage the difference, or I try and engage the conflict in a way that's not detrimental to myself, because the last thing I want to do is leave a situation feeling worse about myself, but try to figure out how can I move about in this situation to where I'm not leaving every single conversation that I have about race or sex or gender or sexuality feeling like a piece of myself is left in that conversation. Because what I want to do is have conversations with people and gain insight into their perspective and add that to my own. And I think that's a way of immunizing myself in trying to adopt a lot of world perspectives into my own to better understand how to come at different conflicts or conversations.
Yeah, I resonate with that so much. I think that's something that I try to emulate within myself on a day-to-day basis. But I will preface this and say that this is something that I'm currently working on for myself on a day-to-day basis, in terms of like engaging in these conversations or engaging with someone who has a different worldview than myself, and trying to, I don't want to say empathize or understand their point of view, and see how their inputs and their viewpoints are the way they are without feeling personally offended. I don't think that I've mastered that. There is always a little bit of me after, especially a very high intensity conversation, that feels a little exhausted or really deflated. So I think for me, it's always about like how I reflect on that interaction or that conversation after it happens. So I've had this conversation, and I'm really going through it internally of like, okay, well, what positives can I take out of that interaction and not focus so much on the negative, and have that be my only thing that encompasses my brain for the rest of the day.
All right, folks. So I asked that question to get us really set up and into the flow of conversation. When Dr. Thurman would host these discussions with students and guests, he would always say that no conversation is forbidden, no stone will be left unturned. And so I wanted to make sure that we had space to do that within our conversation. So let's talk a little bit about election reflections. We saw a significant effort by Black women specifically, but other um, sort of marginalized populations, other women of color, whether it be if they are ethnically, they fall within the Latinx sphere or other ethnic group. We saw a significant organizing effort. And I think that's important for us to acknowledge within our conversation. But more importantly, you have two students who use their own power as students to participate in these organizing efforts. So for you all and Dr. Kendi, talk about your thoughts on this idea of a significant organizing effort to help, get people registered to vote, prepared for the election by Black and Brown women. Talk about your own pursuits and how you contributed or ways that you just supported this idea.
I think one of the things about this election, and not even about this election, but in the past 3 years since 2007, well, 3 years and 8 months now, but who's counting? Since January 20th, 2017, I think one of the really important things is that there has been a lot of mobilization efforts and community organizing efforts from young people. And I think one of the things that when we talk about young people, we often just assume that every young person is among those that's mobilizing and leading the charge. But the results from this election demonstrated that it wasn't just young people, that it was young people of color, young Black people, young Black women who are really organizing within their communities and turning out people to vote. And I think that's something that when I look at my own organizing efforts, I can't say that I was leading this large political machine, but one of the things that I found to be really important and almost maybe not the most important, but that I found that was very encouraging for people is applying my experience, but not in a way, applying my experience as a Black woman who is living in this current political moment to try and enlighten them as to why it's so incredibly important to engage the political process. And I think that's something that we've started to see a shift in, is that people are beginning to have these conversations about how they can continue to affect change in their communities. And it's not just this, there's not this process anymore where we don't engage with government and politics. It's a daily thing, it's an everyday thing. And I think on an individual basis, people are now taking on that individual responsibility to engage the political process. So as a young person myself, I had a bunch of friends, and I had a lot of friends who look like me, who don't look like me, who definitely said that they weren't going to vote and that this political moment was not theirs to participate in. And the only question that I had for them is, well, if you're not going to vote in this election, and which one are you going to vote in? And what do we do if we're not voting in the election? Because if you're not going to vote, that's fine. Or if you don't want to participate in the political process by way of voting, that's okay. But what's the alternative? And that's the question that I would always ask. So in my individual life, that's what I would say was my organizing effort. But when I look at the Black women, especially in Georgia, I'm from Georgia, shout out Georgia, she did her thing. But when I look at Georgia and I look at the organizing efforts of Stacey Abrams and the other 4 women who led the New Georgia Voter Project, it was absolutely incredible what those women were able to do by asking questions like that I would ask to my friends. They were able to register upwards 800,000 people by getting people to understand about the political process. And I think that's one thing that's really important to think about when we are coming in, when we discuss voting or we discuss, political and election efforts, is really to think about how do you get people to turn out to the polls who haven't in the last few years or the few elections. And it's not necessarily a critical process. It's just a way of getting people to understand why it is important to vote or to participate in politics in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're coming at this from different avenues, myself coming from athletics. And, I think for me, I find myself getting very overwhelmed in the larger picture of things. So I always try and start small. And the athletics community was something that I was already tapped into, something that I could attack from my level and know that I had a strong basis there. So, that was my platform, so to speak. But I think for me, and, what motivated myself in this process is always personal experience. And this election, more so than most for me, was more of a moral decision and not so much a political one. And I think in today's time, we get so caught up in and labels. As much as people want to say I don't associate myself with a label, I think we do get caught up in it. And whether it be, and for me, especially for this election, it was not so much focused on a Democratic versus Republic point of view, or a conservative versus a liberal point of view, but more of a moral decision, at least for myself. And what I surround myself by is my teammates, my athletic community. And when I look and I think, and you saw the statistics of how many African American women were stepping up, I wasn't surprised. I've always been surrounded by strong African American women, whether it be my mother, my grandmother, anybody within my family. So I know the power that they hold in a household. And I think for the African American people in general, I think it's once they recognize the strength and the power that they have in their communities, and they're willing to step out and show that effort in other places, they have profound effects anywhere that they step. And you see that in places like Georgia. And that to me was not surprising. I think the hardest part of this whole process, in me becoming more comfortable being involved and motivating other people to get registered and be educated about the election process, is recognizing that I have so many other friends and so many other family members who have this power within themselves, and how do I get them to recognize it and then take action upon that power. And I think for me, it's always been an emotional decision. So, making it something personal and like sharing my experience with it is something that I did as well, to try and get people to understand how important at least this election was to me. And for me, it was always just getting them to think. I can't make you vote. I'm not in there when you're voting or when you're filling out your absentee ballot. So I have no control over that process. But what I can do is make you think about it a few weeks in advance, a few months in advance, really think about the decision that you're making, because it is so easy to just fill out a form and check a box because someone told you to. But to have the understanding of what that check mark means, or what filling in that box means to you, to our history, to the future of this country, is what I try to focus on. So a lot of my effort came from education. I can get you registered, but I want you to understand exactly what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it.
And for me, I was less I was less focused on seeking to change the minds of voters, and more so focused on changing the actions of campaigns. And so I think earlier in the year, I wrote a series of essays on who I called the other swing voter. And these are voters who swing not between Republican and Democrat, but they swing between voting and not voting at all. And I want to distinguish them from people who like never vote and don't consider voting. These are folks who consider voting, but they're sometimes alienated, let's say, by the Democratic candidate, because the Democratic candidate's policies, let's say, aren't progressive. And so, but typically that Democratic candidate isn't conceiving of them as swing voters, and thereby isn't sort of tailoring their campaigns or supporting policies that would actually attract those voters. Um, and so what I was essentially saying to campaigns is, if you want, one of the effective ways, just as you have people organizing them on the ground and trying to convince folks to get registered to vote and to even vote, you could be doing your part too by initiating a platform that's actually going to attract folks, and make folks, or encourage folks to want to support you. And you shouldn't necessarily conceive of these other swing voters, who are typically young people, who are typically people of color, and especially young Black and Latinx voters, as almost like political cattle who you have to sort of drive to the polls. They should be understood as like political free agents in the way you do these older white swing voters, in which you're like, I have to persuade these people, I have to get these people, I have to encourage these people to vote for me. And that's how I want candidates to see young Black and Latinx voters. What can I do as candidates with my policies, with my platform, with my messaging to encourage these folks to vote? Because the swing from voting to not voting helped to win the presidency for Joe Biden, just as the swing from voting for Obama to not voting helped lose the presidency for Hillary Clinton.
So, Dr. Thurman, one of the things that people really don't realize is that his audience was often students. So, he tried his best to speak directly to students and inspire them. This last question is specifically for Dr. Kendi, really quickly. In your work, how do you try to inspire students to take advantage of the power and the agency that they have with issues and things related to voter education and or voting?
Well, first, you have students, just like non-students, just like people who say things like, I don't do politics. I'm sure when y'all were talking to people, encouraging them to vote, you heard that from other students. Well, I don't do politics. I don't think people, so what I encourage students to realize is politics is another word for power. So when you say, I don't do politics, you're effectively saying, I don't do power. And to say, I don't do power is to say, please dominate me. And to say, please dominate me is to say, you know what, I want to be a slave. I don't actually need to be at the table of power. Just do what you want with me. And obviously, I don't think any human wants to be a slave. I don't think any human wants to be dominated. Or I think we should all be striving to not certainly be dominated. So I think it's important for students to realize that relationship, that literally politics is power. That's why it's grueling. That's why it's nasty. That's why it's treacherous, because that's way power is. Literally who can shape policy is who can shape communities, who can shape lives. And so that's why you have people who are clawing and fighting and doing whatever to gain power so that they can pass policy that's going to benefit their interests, as opposed to the interest of, of students. And so I encourage students, no, you should be at the table. You should be fighting for power so that you can pass policy that's going to help, people like you.
All right, so we have two students here. throughout your collegiate experience, you all will spend your time looking to your peers, but also faculty members, administrators, coaches. You will be looking to them to help you define your collegiate experience. And so, this is your opportunity to ask Dr. Kendi, a direct question, and what question do you all have for him?
Makaisha, do you want to go? I can go.
Up to you. You go ahead. You've been leading this whole way. I'll let you keep going.
No, you take the turn now. Go ahead.
Okay. So I guess my first question for you, Dr. Kendi, is, throughout my time, and you mentioned, the other swing voter, and I've seen it, within my family, and I've seen it, as my process of trying to get people registered. And I think something that, like, we as Americans is, recognizing the other person's perspective, which is something I've been working on, which I think we all need to work on as a collective. How do you kind of, when you're engaging with these people who I guess don't see the benefit of voting or participating in, a political action, how do you get them to see the benefit of participating, especially if they're of an older generation and it's not something that they've seen the benefit of for a while, and me as someone younger coming in and trying to change their minds?
Well, first, let me just say, when I'm talking to my elders, I try to encourage them to not use the terms, or you're disrespecting me right now, because I'm sort of challenging their point of view. And so, but, I mean, to get more serious, I think you can start with, what do you see as to ask that person, what is it that you see as a problem? What is it about society that you see as a problem? Do you see it as a problem that in your neighborhood, when it snows, they take forever to shovel the snow in your area, but in the other part of town, they're quick? Do you see it as a problem that, you're not advancing at your job? Like, what do you see? Just what do you consider, or even to think about the things, chances are they've already complained about and they complain about regularly. And so for them to say those things, for you to remember those things, and then you begin to connect the policies that actually lead to the very problem that they have, or that they see, or that they're experiencing. And then you connect that policy to the actual policymaker, who chances are is elected. So you literally, like, this person has the power to shape or change or eliminate that problem. And they're running a campaign that will do it. So you should support them, so you're relieved of that, of that problem. So I think you have to really break it down for folks, because oftentimes, even though people are in our faces, policies are not, and certainly power is not. But we can make that legible for folks.
The question that I have for you, Dr. Kendi, I'm fascinated by this idea that you mentioned about, you're drawing this comparison with politics and power. And one of the things that you said that kind of struck me is thinking about how, when people decide not to engage in politics, it's like they're being dominated, or they're choosing to be dominated, and then and liking it to slavery. So what my question to you is, how do you confront those who would be in opposition to you drawing that comparison from choosing not to engage in politics with some form of domination that would eventually liken someone's condition to that of slavery?
It would depend on how they oppose it. I think obviously I would respond, accordingly. But when I said slave, I specifically used the term slave as opposed to enslaved. And the reason being is because my ancestors were commonly enslaved, meaning we use the term enslaved because these were folks who were commonly resisting their enslavement. And so again, if you're somebody who is being dominated and you're not resisting that domination, you know, that's more of a rendering of being a slave, as opposed to you're somebody who's being dominated in chattel and you're constantly resisting that, you're enslaved. So, you know, but to sort of give it more clarity, but I think what I was really trying to articulate is that the way in which we as individuals, and certainly as a collective organized force, we have power. And I think that that's what, you know, we have to realize the power that we do have, and we have to wield the power that we do have, and we have to seize sort of power when we can seize it. And I think the genius of American power is not just the way in which it's wielding that power, but it also convinces people that they have no power, or it convinces people to not even engage in the fight for power. That's how you win. That's how you maintain power. That, you know, I mean, even at a, you know, you take the case of an elected official, you know, you want to be so dominant in your district that nobody ever runs against you, right? You know, in the same way, that's how dominant American power is, because you have folks who are being subjected to the power who aren't even actively resisting it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things too in thinking about this notion of power, and I like how you kind of frame it in that the means to the end of America is almost power, and you look at politicians, government officials who try to cling on to this, and I think a follow-up question that I would have to that is this power something that we should strive for, and thinking about how we vision forward, or how we reimagine our political process. What is the end goal of that if it's this power that has kind of pigeonholed us to this position that we're in, where people can feel as though being removed from the political process is also a process in relinquishing them of their power?
I'm happy you asked this, because it reminds me of something that I believe a BU alum said. Martin Luther King Jr. said I think in 1967, in which he talked about how some of his early thinking and expressions were void of the recognition that fundamentally the racial struggle was a power struggle. And so I think that it's important for people to realize that this racial struggle, just like the struggle, the gendered struggle, just like the struggles around sexual orientation, around many different sort of identity groups and even national groups, these are power struggles at the core. But that doesn't mean, he also argued against those who said that, well, if you have your power, you're fundamentally corrupted. No, he talked about the combination of power and love being about justice, right? And so really we're seeking to seize power, and then use that power lovingly to create a just and equitable society.
And I'll go along that same line of thinking with my next question. I mean, we've seen so much participation, at least from, the young African-American community in this election. And, my only fear in, history repeats itself of we have a strong showing like we did with the Obama election, and having a not strong showing again when it comes the time to elect a new president. How is it that we, keep in mind that struggle for power and not have people get so bogged down and like, yes, technically this is a win for us, but President-elect Joe Biden doesn't look like me, you know what I mean? And we do have Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, who does represent very many of us within that minority community. But how do we keep that momentum going and that movement moving without losing so many people to fatigue, or to seeing someone like President-elect Joe Biden and have that not be someone like one of us?
Well, first, if the irony about 2020, particularly the Democratic, campaigns, particularly in the primaries, is the primary supporters of the two front-running candidates, who were old white men, were simply not old white men. So, in the case of Joe Biden, you particularly had, middle-aged, sometimes older Black folks, particularly in the South. And for Bernie Sanders, it was typically young folks, especially, young white and Black and Latinx folks. And so what those folks showed is that certainly representation matters, and people were incredibly excited, for of course, Kamala Harris becoming the first woman, as well as first Black and even Indian American woman. But that wasn't everything, right? People were very thoughtful, about the policies, about the sort of a presence of different sort of candidates, and so I think that's the type of sort of awareness that we have to maintain. What policies are you putting forth? How are we organizing to ensure that this new administration is going to root out systemic racism, as they keep saying they're going to do? And we need to, of course, hold them accountable. But the only way to hold them accountable is to organize among ourselves in organizations that have that power to hold them accountable.
So we have a question from the student audience. As we move, actually, yeah, we're good. As we move to be more anti-racist, does that mean breaking the system and building another? And do we keep some good parts of the whole system?
So when we think of the system, let's make sure we have a clear understanding of what we're talking about. The system, we should understand it as essentially a collection or a combination of policies and policymakers. And we can sort of understand policymakers as effectively power. And so when we look at the sort of system of policies that persist in this country, we can look at, okay, what are the policies that are leading to inequity or equity? And obviously we can get rid of those policies that are maintaining or leading to inequity, which are, I suspect, the vast majority of our policies. And we can retain the policies that are creating or maintaining some form, of equity. I want us to be very clear, about what the problem is, because I don't want us to just think sort of broadly that there's this sort of system that sort of functions on its own with AI, and we have to eliminate everything. We may have to eliminate everything, or we may not. We have to really come to understand and really study the system in and of itself, all of its policies, all of its practices, all of its power, and figure out what needs to be eliminated.
So when we think about we're still talking about policies, and I think that's something that's really critical to pay attention to. But when we think about this, you are the director of the Center for Antiracist Research, right? One of the questions that I want to ask is thinking about specifically when people approach this idea of anti-racism broadly, what do you think is something that we're getting wrong when we talk about anti-racism, whether it's in the more casual setting or if it's in the media setting? What's something about this idea and this process of being anti-racist that isn't being achieved?
So I can see the way in which the term anti-racist is replacing the identity not racist. So while a year ago, people were raising their hand to say, I'm not racist. You have people raising their hand to say, I am anti-racist. That is who I am. And that's but I argue that no one becomes an anti-racist. Like, that's only something we can strive to be. So if in the next moment we're challenging racism, we're being anti-racist. We don't know what we're going to do in the next moment, right? If in the last moment we were upholding racism, we were being racist. And so it's not a fixed category. It's not an identity. But I see it too often being understood and used as such. It's almost like a replacement term for not racist, when not racist historically has been considered to be an identity. That's who I am. I am not racist because my friend is Black. But anti-racist has nothing to do with, who your friends are, where you live, the color of your skin. All it has to do with is, do you think that there's something wrong with, let's say, Black people? Are you challenging those policies that are harming Latinx and Native people? That's the question we should be asking.
So follow-up question on that, and particularly to myself with, the Patriot League and, so many institutions, creating these anti-racism committees or commissions, with the goal of being anti-racist in mind. How is it that we get people to understand that concept that that anti-racism is not an identity? And then would you argue in and of itself that then policy, like, can a policy be anti-racist? Like, is that something that we have to push now more instead of this anti-racist identity mindset?
So yeah, I mean, I'm happy you asked that, because you can have a person who holds both racist and anti-racist ideas. So in their mind, they, let's say, value the cultures of Native people as on the same level as their own cultures. But they think that there's something inferior about the cultures of, let's say, Black folks. So when they're relating culturally to Native people, they're being anti-racist. But when they're relating culturally to Black folks, they're being racist. The same person can hold both types of ideas, and people are deeply complex in that way. So that's why it's hard to say that someone is essentially racist or anti-racist. But a policy, we can measure whether a policy is leading to inequity or equity. An idea, we can assess whether an idea is a connotation of hierarchy or equality. And so indeed a policy or an idea can be racist, or, is essentially racist, can be essentially racist or anti-racist in the way that a person is distinct. Just like an institution, like an individual, is a collection of policies and ideas, and policymakers. So it's harder to make a case that it is essentially something. And so that's what, in a way, makes it a little more complex.
We have another student question that came in through our Q&A function. Dr. Kendi, in my class on truth this semester, we've been discussing some excerpts from your book and some of the points you made in it. My final paper is specifically on whether or not there is any contradiction in your writing. Racist, and this is a quote from your book, racist is not a pejorative term, but racism is a crime. The question is, can you elaborate on that idea?
I'm sorry. So these were taken from two different parts, of the book. So when I spoke about racist being a pejorative term, I was actually referencing Richard Spencer, who is the coiner of the term alt-right, who is one of the leaders of the alt-right movement, who helped organize the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, which led to a tremendous amount of violence. He once said that racist isn't a descriptive term, it's a pejorative term. What he was arguing is that he was essentially saying to white people, when people, when people sort of diagnose you as being racist, they are trying to they're trying to attack you and hurt you. That's essentially what they're seeking to do, not describe what you're doing, not diagnose your illness so you can get treatment. And so fundamentally, I was arguing that no, when you say that something is a pejorative, you're fundamentally saying, I'm saying this to hurt you and attack you, as opposed to describe that what you just did was racist and you need to change, right? And obviously, racism is a crime should be pretty straightforward.
So there's another question from the audience, and I think actually I would love to hear you all as students, your perspective on this as well. I'm sure many of us have seen in the news the past couple of days some of the comments President Obama has made involving the term defund the police. I was wondering, what are your thoughts surrounding this topic? Do you feel like coining terms and buzzwords such as this one ultimately hinder social movements?
So I actually am writing, I actually wrote a piece in the Atlantic that's going to come out soon that addresses my thoughts on this issue. So I don't really want to give it away in its totality. But what I will say is that every social movement was galvanized. People have been mobilized and organized by what people now call slogans or buzzwords or snappy words, right? And so somehow, I guess it depends on the word that determines whether people are going to derisively call it a slogan or a buzzword. Because last I checked, civil rights or human rights is a slogan. You can describe that as a slogan or as a buzzword. Last I checked, immediate emancipation was a term that was used to organize people. And so fundamentally, you have many activists today who recognize that communities are being starved of resources for schools, who are being starved of resources for public health, being starved of resources for mental health, all sorts of social services, partly because there's so much money, going to police departments because these people are conceived of as dangerous people. And it's imagined widely, even among some folks of color, that the cause of the crime, if the crime exists, is the Blackness of the people. And the only way to hold it off or to hold it back is to invest in a militarized sort of police and a series of prisons that will get these sort of animals and rapists, whether Latinx or Black, off the streets. It is not conceived of as crimes, let's say, of poverty. It's not conceived of as dangerous unemployed neighborhoods. It's conceived of as dangerous Black neighborhoods. And the only way we can restrain those Black folks is through police. And so police, in a way, function in the way slaveholders used to function. Meaning, when people in the 1840s and 50s talked about abolition, you had folks like, so those Black folks are going to be freed and they're going to run ramshod all over this country? No, keep them in slavery. That was the fear that many, particularly white Americans, had, and why they opposed sort of immediate emancipation, because they believed that Black people were by nature criminals. And they would, without the sort of countervailing sort of control of white slaveholders, they would essentially ram ramshot over this country. And it's still believed today. That's why it's so fearful for so many people to completely reimagine public safety. And so I don't think this is a buzz term. People are organizing around this because they recognize that a better way to reduce poverty is to provide resources and opportunities, not police and jails.
And he wanted the student opinion, so I will opine. One of the things is if I I think Barack Obama, and I've grown up with Barack Obama as a two-term president. I grew up 2008. I was 9 years old, and it was a historic moment to see a black man be elected president. I think in the last few years, as I've come of age politically, as I've come of age in this new world order that we're living in, come of age during a time where Donald Trump was the sitting president, there are some things and ideas about Barack Obama that I currently hold that have changed. And I think one of the things that I've realized right now is Barack Obama, though he was this phenom when I was 9 years old, right now it's fair that I criticize him because I think what he's still doing is playing this political game. And he's playing the political game because Democrats have arrived at this moment where they fear that the party is that there's a risk of the party losing itself. And I think Barack Obama is trying to save a party because that's his vision of how you rectify the world, and it's through like party politics. And so there's this fear, like Dr. Kendi is talking about, at least like how what I'm interpreting is Barack Obama is feeding into this fear that many people have, that when you start to say things like defund the police, that you are automatically ostracizing a group of people who you eventually want to get in and get involved with the democratic political machine. But the problem with that is that defunding the police, like Dr. Kendi is saying, it's not just a political word. There are people that are using it in order to actually affect change on the grassroots level. And I think that's one of the things that, President Barack Obama or saying that, slogans like defunding the police are dangerous. It's not, because it's something that it's an idea, and while it's 3 words, ideas wield power, and I think people are trying to find something to really describe the sentiment or describe what they are trying to fix, and it's become this term, defund the police. And the same way that Black Lives Matter in 2012 began to mean something, and it continues to mean something. Same way that hashtag Me Too in 2016, 2017 began to mean something. So, I'm a public relations major, so I see the value in how, words and phrases can come together to create this idea and this concept that people can rally behind. And I think that President Barack Obama, I understand where he's coming from. I just don't think that, from my perspective and the generation that I'm coming from, that slogans or ideas that you can just boil down into 3 words, I do think they have a purpose. And I think him saying that they don't is trying to trivialize this current moment that we're in, and trying to really ostracize the generation of people that did buy into his politics. And I think that's something that President Barack Obama and now sitting President-elect Joseph Biden, they're going to have to be really careful about how they engage in conversations with people from my generation or people who really do buy into these slogans or ideas like defund the police, Black Lives Matter, and the continuation of this hashtag-esque movement.
Coming from my perspective, I try to see it from both sides. And, being a younger generation growing up, and I think social media has made, the ability to take a slogan and have it be the identity of an entire movement. I think social media is behind a lot of that occurring, and why it is so effective, because you can make something like hashtag Me Too or hashtag Black Lives Matter or hashtag defund the police, travel so quickly, within seconds, and reach millions of people in so many different locations, where you have people using one slogan that was coined in the United States, across the pond somewhere in, England or a whole different country, and have it mean the same thing. So I see the power behind the slogan, but I also think it's so very easy for someone to, use a hashtag or throw up a black screen on social media and not learn what the actual intent is behind that slogan. And I think that's why, and you see it on both sides with, someone looking or saying or using the term Obamacare and using it as a negative connotation, but going behind and, being signed up for the Affordable Care Act, having that be their mode of, health insurance, and not seeing the irony in that situation. So I think when when you have a slogan like defund the police, and people who can educate themselves on what that slogan means know that it's not removing a police force out of the entire equation, but driving funds towards something that we know would better an entire community and not just protecting only small portion of it, right? Something that we know has positive outcomes for generations to come, and not something that's just an immediate band-aid on a wound that needs surgery, right? So I think, and something that I've taken it upon myself, and I think our generation is starting to pick up on, is that we have to look more deeply into statements like defund the police or Black Lives Matter or hashtag Me Too, and actually pay attention to what content that hashtag is attached to, and not so much what it is at face value, and only reading a headline and trusting a headline. So I think that's something that we as a society have to get better on. I think we allowed social media and its novelty and how quickly things can get spread with just 140 characters, and not really pay attention to the actual meaning behind our statements. And you see that everywhere. So I think that's something that must be taken into account when looking at those slogans, but they are beneficial. You're not going to see something spread as fast as you will hashtag Me Too or hashtag defund the police or hashtag Black Lives Matter. That's the way our society works. So I think you take the tools and you do with them what you can, but we have to be careful with our intent.
All right, folks. Dr. Kendi, I know you gotta go. We do have one special last question that we love to ask any of our guests. For Dr. Thurman, community was the single most important quest of his life. And so he believed reconciliation was essential to community, some of the things we talked about today. And he also believed that reconciliation and love were synonymous with each other. So for you, from what you've seen with our latest organizing efforts by Black and Brown women, how have those organizing efforts, the push for a new president, how have these things helped you further to understand love and reconciliation?
Well, for me, that I think many of these Black and Brown women activists are driven by love. And so when I see their passion, when I see their organizing prowess, when I see them pushing for a different type of society, when I see them trying to sort of lift the knee of racism off of the necks of, Black and brown people, I see them doing that as acts of love. And so that sort of compels and shows me just how critical, we should be fueled by love.
Thank you, everybody, for attending our event tonight. Thank you, Dr. Kendi, for taking time to be with us here tonight. For those who ask questions in the Q&A function, we do plan to do this a few more times, our Questions with Kendi series, and we will try our best to feature students as well. Thank you all for coming in tonight. Again, want to thank our lovely students, Makaisha Hayes and Arshel Telemak, for being with us. And thank you to the folks at Let's for helping us out. And of course, all of these things aren't possible without the work that the staff here at the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground does to make all of these events possible. So thank you to those members as well. And good night, be you and be well.